since we all are very mindful and concerned about our food systems and want to have a glimpse of how the future would look like and explore about the necessary efforts to be made. This session will unpack the complexity of India's complex food systems, which are constantly reshaped by forces of urbanization, feminizations of agriculture due to outmigration of male workforce, increased interdependency on global markets, fragmentations of landholdings, and structural constraints of smallholders to commercialize and diversify their agriculture. The session aims to explore how to address these challenges and in such a way that would transform food systems to achieve climate and livelihood resilience, increased well-being, and sustainability. Let me introduce our moderator, Aparna Bijapurkar. Aparna Bijapurkar is partner in Boston Consulting Group in the public sector and social impact domain. Aparna co-leads Boston Consulting Group's India's work and in agriculture and rural livelihoods, working with central and state governments, not-for-profit and private agribusinesses. She has also worked extensively in the areas of education, employment, and entrepreneurship, and on the transformation of large-scale public service delivery systems. Many thanks, Aparnaji, for moderating this session today and take us on the journey of learning and exploring the future of food systems through the lens of the rest of our panelists, who are the thought and action leaders in this domain. So over to you, Aparnaji, to introduce our esteemed panelists and the journey ahead. So Aparnaji, please.
Thank you, Ashok. We have a very distinguished panel today, and I think it's exciting because each of them comes to the statement, what is the future of food systems and income and employment from a very different angle. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Let me start with Mekhla. Mekhla Krishnamurthy is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University, and she's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. At CPR, Mekhla leads the State Capacity Initiative, which is a major interdisciplinary research and practice program committed to addressing the challenges and possibilities of building state capacity in democratic and federal India. Over the last 20 years, Mekhla's research, policy, and professional engagements have involved work across a range of field sites and subjects, including informal women's courts, popular justice and dispute resolution, community health workers and public health and nutrition, agriculture and agricultural markets, land, water, and livelihoods. And in that process, her work has placed her at the intersection of partnerships between academia, public policy, government, grassroots civil society, private sector, and philanthropic foundations. And Mekhla, we're expecting you to bring all of these perspectives to the table today. Mekhla is also a UCL Global Excellence Scholar and a non-resident scholar at the Center of Advanced Study of India in the University of Pennsylvania. So welcome, Mekhla, and thank you so much for joining the panel today. Our next panelist, Our next panelist, Mr. S. Shivakumar, is the group head of Agri and IT business at ITC Limited, which is India's foremost private sector company. He also holds the responsibility of ITC's social investment program and is the chairman of Technico Agri-Science and vice chairman of ITC Infotech India Limited. Mr. Shivakumar also has worked with farmer cooperatives for 6 years before joining ITC in 1989. And he was the divisional chief executive of the agribusiness division from 96 to 2017. During this time, many of you may know he started the e-Chopal initiative, which was developed under his leadership. Shiv also serves on the advisory council of MORD and the NRLM programs, the Commodity Derivatives Advisory Committee of SEBI, and the management committee of the National Agriculture Higher Education Project of the Ministry of Agriculture. He's also been a member of the boards of NABARD and IRMA, and is vice chairman of the WEF's Global Agenda on Social Innovation. So welcome, Shiv, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Aparna.
Last but not the least, we have Pravesh Sharma. Pravesh is a former IAS officer and has been engaged with the food and agri sector for over 3 decades at the highest policy and administrative leadership levels, both in state government, central government, as well as multilateral agencies. He is widely credited with building the FPO movement in India, and particularly, building an ecosystem addressing the core needs of farmers for capital, technology, and markets. Pravesh also, is the chairperson of the National Association of Farmer Producer Organizations and the co-founder and CEO of Kamatan Farm Tech Private Limited. In May 2021, he joined the board of Samunnati Agro and brings a rich perspective on, inclusive supply chains and integrating farmers with markets. So welcome, Pravesh, and excited to have you today and look forward to hearing your perspectives, on FPOs, on, government, as well as the potential of startups today. Getting started with our discussion, Ashok set the context very well. And in that context of, India's changing food systems, which have been driven by, greater urbanization, feminization, fragmentation of landholdings, increased, integration with global markets, and of course, more recently, the focus on both the contribution to, climate-related challenges, but equally and perhaps more importantly, the impact of climate-related challenges. It's really important, in this context, to really understand what's happening to incomes and employment in agriculture and the broader rural ecosystem. So I think with that context, wanted to really tee up and have each of our panelists actually take a few minutes and tell us how they see the future of income and employment from their vantage point. Meghla, we'll start with you. This is, a question that's really been on my mind for a while, and I'm guilty of it, I must say. We talk about the small and marginal farmer, right? And this is really not a monolith. I mean, it is more than 80% of our agricultural workforce. And I think your work and research really has pointed to very significant differences across this population, right? So I'd love for you to tell us what's really happening to the agricultural workforce and to incomes. Are there distinct segments? How are they evolving? What are their needs and aspirations? And how really should we understand the small and marginal farmer?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aparna. Let me just begin very quickly by congratulating Transform Rural India for the colloquy and this entire series of really remarkable and interesting discussions and really important discussions. So many congratulations. And also to say it's just a complete privilege for me to be on this panel with both Mr. Shiv Kumar and Mr. Pravesh Sharma. When I began my work in Madhya Pradesh, the field work that I did for my PhD in Harda Mandi, I think both of them were just such important sources of insight and experience and a lot of encouragement. When one both agreed and disagreed and was picking up different kinds of realities and perspectives. And I think that's what researchers need most, right, is both encouragement, but also that kind of critical engagement. So it's a real privilege for me to be here today. Just to take your question, I think it's so important for a number of reasons. I think it's very cliched now to talk about diversity in agriculture and diversity in India in general. Right? We tend to go, it's diverse and it's complex, but then this is India. Everything is diverse and complex. And I remember throughout recent discussions on agriculture, if you start talking about ground realities and, the actual agroecological diversity, the diversity within districts, sometimes, within blocks, you'll see such different dynamics. The same commodity in different states will move completely differently. Different commodities in the same state will move very differently. The same commodity in different blocks in the same district will move differently. And have very different relationships. And when you start pointing this out, I think usually there's a blankness that happens in policy discussions. And we retreat to our usual small, medium, large farmers. We retreat to a conversation around certain crops that we are comfortable with, often food grains, or very large sort of generalizations between food grains and oil seeds and pulses, as if even within oil seeds, pulses, food grains, and fibers, you don't have an enormous amount of diversity and complexity. But when you want to start talking about agriculture markets and agricultural incomes and rural economy, actually, specification is a general condition. And I think we know this because anybody who even buys or sells anything in an agricultural market specifies. Right? They do that as a precondition. What are they selling? How much are they selling? Where are they selling? And at when they are selling. So, these are markets that are remarkably specific and contextualized. And yet there are really a set of important structural conditions, right? And that is very important. Land has remained a very important structural feature. But again, when we talk about land in agriculture, historically, we've talked about the landed and the landless. So landlords and labor. We've talked about landlords and tenants. Then we've sort of moved our conversation, again, like in this big, medium, large, very stylized descriptions of landholders. But land remains incredibly important. And what we are seeing is that land ownership and land possession and land use is not all the same, right? But when we think of large farmers, we think of owners. And policy is still very attached to ownership. States are trying now increasingly to move away from ownership as the fundamental fulcrum of organizing its understanding of farming households, but we still struggle with this, right? So again, we are seeing that in many cases, it's the large farmers who lease in land. In other cases, it's small landless farmers who take in land. Right. So again, this is very important, and it depends, irrigated land, unirrigated land, how, your terms of relations are with those things. So I think this is one. The second thing is we have tended historically in agriculture to separate out functions. So production, exchange, markets, procurement, distribution, as if these are all discrete functions that different actors are involved in. But these really shape relations between each other, right? So when you take credit in an off season and you sell sometimes to the same person from whom you took credit, other times to another creditor, these are all interlocked relations. They have been, but again, they're not stylized. We have historically talked about as if all agricultural markets are interlocked. And yet what we find when we go to the field is that in Bihar and Odisha, we didn't see that extent of interlocking that you still see in Punjab. And in Madhya Pradesh, you saw it in the 1980s, and it actually shifted with the arrival of canal irrigation, changes in relations of production, their introduction of soybean, moving from cotton to soybean in these parts. So it's temporarily also shifting. So I think our old, very stylized ways of thinking about diversification are limited now, and we need a fresh and new conversation about the kinds of things that are emerging. I want to just make one other really important point to start with. I think in recent times, a lot of data has shown us that rural households, particularly those who are small and marginal farmers, as we were talking about, depend increasingly on wage income from wages and non-farm sources, right, non-agricultural income, rather than farm income. And that has led to a lot of people saying farmers are really now laborers. But I think one thing that we have seen historically is that if people do badly in agriculture, they diversify. If people do well in agriculture, they diversify. At different times in different places, you have trajectories of distress-driven diversification, which is a lot of the kinds of diversification we are seeing today, which is actually push diversification rather than being pulled into other sectors of the economy or moving into other sectors on the back of surplus, right? Where rural incomes, farm incomes lead industrialization, as we've seen in parts of Andhra at a certain period of time and in other places, right? So you have this challenge where we are now thinking of diversification as if there's a binary, but agriculture, the state of agriculture is to diversify. The question is the terms of that diversification. And for India, it's a very important thing because we have an unprecedented structural transformation challenge in this country. And all the usual truisms that people will move from agriculture into non-farm haven't happened at the pace, that large farmers will replace small farmers haven't happened at that pace. So we are going to have to invent a new imagination for how we're going to deal with this, not assume a teleology, engage much more deeply with actually existing conditions, and then move. And I think the fundamental challenge that we have is this: the same conditions that make agriculture the most absorptive and resilient sectors of the economy are also the ones that mean that people don't accumulate in this sector, right? It's the same conditions. It's highly adaptive, highly informalized, highly dynamic, but it is a sector that has largely now worked itself towards reproduction without accumulation. And that is a dynamic that we have to change. So it remains a sponge. We saw it in COVID. The question is, how do you change the terms of engagement for farmers at different levels? I'll stop here and we can come back into the details.
Yeah, no, I think, thank you. I think the the takeaway around diversification is a given. We talk about it a lot in the context of distress. But I think, like you're saying, it's a positive cycle as well. And I'd love to come back to that, I think, later in the conversation. Pravesh, over to you. You've seen, the Indian agri sector very closely over the last several decades, I think, from many different perspectives and lenses. And, we often, joke that if you read any report on Indian agriculture over the last several decades, many of the themes continue to be the same. So, as we look at, India at 2047 or 2050, I mean, what are the 5 big shifts that you believe really need to be made? But I think more importantly, what are the new levers or tools that are available today that we didn't have before that are likely to be able to, catalyze these shifts and changes? Would love to get your perspective.
Thank you, Aparna. And thank you to TRIF for including me in this panel and being part of this very unique, I think, conversation. TRIF and the partner organizations are doing such incredible work on the ground. It's a great opportunity to hear some of the perspectives which are coming out of this work. So thank you again for inviting me. To take your question head on, Aparna, I always talk about the 5 yaksha prashna, if you will, of agriculture. And maybe I'll respectfully differ from you when you say that the themes have remained the same. Actually, the themes have changed dramatically in every decade since 1947. Mekhla just referred to diversification as one of the very interesting changes that is happening. But let's stay with the bigger picture here. So the way I list these 5 yaksha prashna, and in fact addressing or how well we address these 5 challenges over the next decade, maybe even a decade and a half, will decide the trajectory and also the outcomes of the people engaged in the sector. So the first and foremost, it's very interesting that COVID and the events which have succeeded COVID globally have brought this question to the center stage, not just of Indian agriculture, but in fact globally. And that is what I call the big question of how are we going to balance the needs of food, fuel, and feed. This 3F conundrum, I would call it, all the 3 Fs are today in conflict with each other. Many eminent people in this country, including very distinguished economists who I admire for their work, have been saying for close to a decade that India has achieved a state of food surplus. In fact, we should not be producing so much food. Alarmingly, for the last 4 or 5 years, I'm hearing this increasingly from policy platforms. And I go back I'm a student of history. I'm sorry, I don't know much economics, but I look at the historical evidence before us, where every 70 years before 1947, we've had a major famine. It's for the first time since 1947 that this country has not had a famine. And for all the other challenges, if there's one thing that we really got right, is to become food self-sufficient and at least address macro food security. Yes, there are challenges in distribution and access in some pockets, but I would say every decade has only seen improvement. But today I'm seeing the old conflicts come back to us with a new challenger. So earlier it was a challenge between balancing the needs of food and feed for your animal population. Now there's a third contender, which is fuel. And because there's a huge guilt complex going around in the Western world about what they've done to the climate, so the cost is actually going to be borne disproportionately by the smallholders that you're talking about in countries like India, the rest of South Asia, and maybe Africa, where you will find that products like maize, sorghum, now increasingly we Indian policymakers are throwing around random sentences saying that paddy should be one of the feedstocks into producing ethanol. A country that has still not solved the access problem, in a convincing manner, is talking about maybe shifting food production to ethanol production so that people like, some of the people on this panel could buy, modern efficient cars which can reduce their carbon footprint, right? She was smiling. He's going to be a big player in this. So I would place as this as the central and the biggest yakshprashan today. How are we going to address it and balance it? Maybe we can talk later about the answers. The second challenge, in my view, is the crashing factor productivity, which unfortunately is not being addressed either by the government at a policy level or unfortunately also by the scientific community. And there are two factors of production which are actually going to be, if we don't address this properly, the death knell of this sector. One is soil and the other is water. And I would place soil above water in the hierarchy of needs, because the alarming, I would say, almost catastrophic depletion in the carbon content of soil is going to really lead to diminishing productivity and therefore diminishing production. We need to address this on a war footing. Again, I won't go into details of what needs to be done. The third crisis that we are facing is a human resource crisis in agriculture. If you see any of the last 3 situational surveys of agriculture, which the government brings out every decade, increasingly the answer to the question, would you like to leave agriculture? The overwhelming number of farmers say, yes, given a choice, I would like to leave agriculture. So agriculture is truly today the employer of last resort, or a distress employer. As we saw in COVID, okay, that was a positive development, that people could go back from the cities and actually be absorbed, maybe at poor wages, which is why rural wages are stagnant for the last 3 years. So how do you make agriculture attractive for the next generation of youth? Can you give them the aspiration, the glamour that they today see in even the lowest level of city jobs, driving motorcycles to deliver pizza to you in the evening when you're back from office and can't cook? So this third challenge of the HR crisis, in my view, unless addressed properly, is going to be another big challenge for the sector. The fourth is already referred to by Mekla, which is the delayed structural adjustment in our economy. And of course, agriculture is situated in the larger economy. Some of you may have seen the recent data from a high of around 49% around 6 years ago. The share of agriculture actually went down in 2019 to around 41% of the labor force, but has actually risen after COVID to around 43. We can maybe see this as a temporary bump, but the more interesting finding is that unlike the larger, world's experience, the shift out of agriculture is not into higher paying manufacturing jobs, but rather into the informal economy, in services, the so-called gig economy, which is actually also being glamorized. Without social security, without the benefits that typically come with organized employment. How do you address and achieve an orderly shift of the economy and reduce the share of agriculture, but in a more, shall we say, higher value area? Lastly, I'm sorry I've overshot the time that I thought I would by a minute. I'll close in 30 seconds. All this which is happening globally, today, youngsters sitting in tier 3 or tier 4 towns are playing with their cell phones and telling their father, "Dekh bapu, tu apna time barbad kar raha hai kheti mein, ye maine dekh crypto mein kitna paisa bana liya." Today, the capital flows to agriculture are diminishing at an alarming rate. Whether it's the organized financial institutions, whether it's the new generation fintech companies, the shift is away from the rural sector into what they rightly see as the higher growth sectors in the services and maybe some of the higher technology areas. Unless we solve this, and thank you for introducing me and I keep on repeating this like a stuck record, agriculture needs solutions to capital, markets, and technology. Capital is the key that unlocks the other two. Unless we solve for this. So I'm just going to close in 5 seconds by saying these 5 crises, the food, feed and fuel clash, the factor productivity crash, the HR crisis, the delayed structural adjustment, and the slowing capital inflows. These are going to be the crises that we have to solve in the next 10 years. Maybe I'll take the second part of your question if you can come back to me later. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Paresh. I love this. And I think you've made my job for the rest of the hour easy, because I'm hoping we'll be able to unpack, each of these in turn. I think before we get there, Shiv, next question for you, which is, I think, despite, COVID and the events and perhaps the uncertainty of the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of optimism in business and markets around the agriculture sector. And I think companies like yours are at the forefront of making big bets, newer commodities, global markets, digital as a source of advantage. What are the big changes that we can expect, business to drive in the agri sector? And I think, the follow-up to that is really, what will it mean for farmer and rural incomes and employment?
Yeah, I think let me pick from essentially these different questions that Pravesh raised and the canvas that Mekla painted. And that's where the corporate sector sees the opportunity. Obviously, a key outcome has got to be how value for farmers gets created in terms of increasing incomes, less amount of risk, and more sustainable access to resources, whether water and soil and all of these kinds of things. And these very issues obviously need to be solved, and that's where the opportunity exists, and that's why we have a number of corporates participating. Three big shifts is what I think will deal with these challenges. One, Pravesh talked about, we in a way in the past we did achieve to some degree the macro level food security, barring some nuances in terms of accessibility, affordability, and that kind of thing that he mentioned. Now, where does the value lie that we need to capture? Obviously, it's in the consumption, the evolving shifts in the consumption that exists in the country, the opportunity that exists globally. That's where the value lies. We need to capture it and plow it back to the farmer. So what it means is that the fundamental shift needs to be a demand responsive agricultural production, as opposed to a production driven supply chain that we had created in the first instance to deal with shortages that we had in the first round post-independence. In making our whole system transit into a demand responsive production system is where the marketeers need to come in terms of how do you connect demand to production, be it in terms of specific type of attributes, which type of crops, all the diversification, everything else that we talked about. So that is one major shift, and that's where the anchor role needs to be played by marketeers. Yeah, it can be corporates, it's possible. The collection of farmers can play that role. It's possible government can create agencies who can do this kind of role. And for large part, I would presume that it's the corporates who will link up markets back to the production system. The second key shift is this whole aspect of how do you bring the capital and technology into the farming. It can only happen through collective effort of the private sector, the farmers, and the government. Each one has different sets of strengths in terms of what can be brought to the whole food and agricultural chain. And that needs to get orchestrated to one of partnership. So hitherto, along the chain, the relationship between one leg and the next leg is a buyer-seller relationship, which is typically a zero-sum game, where it is adversarial. I squeeze out price from you as my supplier, I can make more money, and vice versa. But if we have to collectively deliver value to the consumer at one end and plow back something to the farmer as a fairer share of it, it requires deployment of the capital and technology, entrepreneurial capability, and all the resources that each one differentially possesses, and therefore that partnerships, as opposed to traditional adversarial relationship is the second major shift that would occur. And a third is that Meghla talked about the diversity. There are different crops, different geographies, different kinds of farmers, and so on. Now, right solutions for different contexts is something that markets can bring much more efficiently. How do you deal with crops where the reciprocal dependency between a buyer and seller is very high? Typically, these are small acreage, closed loop crops, which are specialized. The nature of engagement needs to be very different versus large acreage, commoditized kind of crops. And how do you deal with price risk management, and how do you deal with productivity and attributes there? So therefore, really creating these toolkits that are appropriate for different contexts rather than one national solution is another shift that is taking place. I think all these three is where one sees an opportunity, and that's the reason you see a huge amount of optimism, notwithstanding the hiccups that will come along the way, that one sees that at the end of the day, the food needs to be produced, farmers' incomes have to go up, the natural resources need to be preserved, the climate change need to be dealt with. All of this can happen through these three shifts, and that's where a center and square role can be played by the businesses.
Great. Thanks, Shiv. I think taking, from your first trend, right, where you talk about demand responsive production and how the market side, plays a role, but it has to interact perhaps with, like you said, a collection of farmers or even government playing a role to facilitate. We hear a lot about, cluster development, perhaps PPP-based cluster development. And I think when you talk to the buyers at the other end of that, there's a strong, desire and need for strong farmer producer organizations, right? I think those that can manage for quality, I think those that can take on perhaps some working capital management. And Pravesh, I think that brings me to you, which is you lead a lot of, work with FPOs. And I think while we've seen a few examples of very successful FPOs, right? And if I asked everybody on this panel to name them, we might end up with the same 3 or 5 top names. Many FPOs, I think, struggle to survive beyond the initial incubation period, right? So I think from your perspective and given your work, what really are the core challenges that need to be addressed either through policy or other interventions to really get this FPO ecosystem going?
Well, thank you. So this really is the, as they call in Hindi, the dukti rag, the pain point, which I have been engaged with for now close to 2 decades. And as I said briefly in my earlier intervention, the 3 basic requirements of any agricultural enterprise, something of the scale of ITC has solved it over a period of time through its own set of, shall we say, solutions, given its space in the corporate sector. But whether it's an FPO or it's ITC, the requirement for raising capital, for mobilizing appropriate technology, and for accessing markets, it's common. If you look at the ecosystem, and Shiv, please pardon me for using ITC because it's one of the, shall we say, successful examples of an agri-enterprise, which I would like to see for thousands of FPOs. It's because it could successfully solve for raising capital, for accessing and upgrading technology frequently, and ultimately also addressing its market through all kinds of innovative ways. When people, accuse FPOs of being, shall we say, a hope that failed or not having met the potential that, they could as a group of producers, I always ask the question, have we created the ecosystem to sustain FPOs like an ecosystem exists to sustain corporate agri-enterprises like ITC? Shall we say, the presence of a capital market which can be accessed, or financial institutions which could provide working capital, or an array of institutions that develop technologies for food processing, marketing, packaging, etc. The honest answer is that we have not. Simply by, shall we say, getting farmers to come together, and farmers actually may be today recognized as members of an FPO because you have registered a body. But the truth is that farmers have only survived by collaboration. No farming system in the world would have existed today, but for the collaboration that takes place by exchange of seed, by sharing information on pest management, by trying to access markets. So it's happening in an informal way in any case. The FPO was an attempt to recognize that inherent collaborative feature of agriculture and try and give it an institutional form. I always believe that the institutional ecosystem to support the FPO, just like as I said, an institutional ecosystem exists to support corporate agri-enterprises, will need to be built alongside the growth of numbers. And perhaps what we see today is an underdevelopment of the ecosystem and the numbers of registered FPOs having, in a sense, outstripped. This is, of course, historically true for all productive sectors, that policy typically lags the development of the opportunity. Since the last 5 years, I can say that some of the challenges that, frankly, I could not address while being part of the system, I see today being solved by, entrepreneurs, by big corporates. I mean, the number of big corporates today that are engaged directly with FPOs would be 200% or 500% of what it was, let's say, in 2010 or 12 when we began this whole campaign. So I'll give two specific examples of how I believe this could actually be a moment when we could see a breakthrough. One of the most promising things that I can see emerging is the idea of having joint stock companies, which are promoted jointly by clusters of FPOs or federations of FPOs and market players. ITC, may be an extreme example, but certainly there is a whole array of small, medium, and getting to be large agri-enterprises that are today recognizing that the nature of agricultural produce cannot be compared, let's say, and I'm, I know going to be hit by all the teenagers. I hope there are none in your audience right now. You can actually live without a cell phone. Many teenagers, Mekla's young daughter might disagree with me, but some of us actually grew up without having smartphones or cell phone, and I can assure you we're quite normal. What I'm saying is that the nature of the product that the farmer brings to the table, it's actually life. It cannot be compared to any industrial product or any service sector activity. Markets, policymakers, financial institutions, investors will have to recognize, and I think nothing has proven this more than COVID and its aftermath. Also, the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war. Today, the drop in acreage of paddy in India is global headlines. You may have seen the feed shift from Bloomberg. They are worried that India, as the largest exporter of rice, if it actually falls in production this year in this current Kharif season, people are going to go hungry all across the world. The ripples that were created by the stoppage of wheat exports. Because you cannot treat the disruption. We have been hearing about the disruption in supply of chips, which apparently has disrupted or delayed the supply of cars. I don't think anybody quite died because their car did not turn up in time. But there are people who are actually going to suffer, at the very least, malnutrition, if not death, because certain supplies from India, from Ukraine are going to be affected. So, number one, I see a great future in these joint stock companies. And number two, I see a tremendous amount of energy and activity in innovative solutions to the need for capital. And as I said earlier, capital will unlock the other two challenges of markets and technology. I won't go into details here, but I would regard these two as the most promising and most important interventions going forward to unlock the opportunity that these FPOs represent. Thank you.
Great. Pravesh, actually a follow-up question just on this. You talk about capital, technology, and markets. But, is there also an aspect around talent? We're expecting FPOs to be procurement managers. We're expecting them to do sales and marketing. We're expecting them to, manage 300 of their, fellow farmers almost as efficiently as an ITC would. Is there a, talent question that we need to think about differently?
So inherent in your question is actually the unasked question: will enough MBAs go and work in FPOs? No, they will not. There will never be enough MBAs who will be attracted to the idea of FPOs. Maybe when there are large federations of FPOs and there is global size, maybe we'll poach some people from ITC, and some management trainees will prefer to go to an FPO rather than to ITC. But the truth is that if you go to the ground today, the amount of managerial talent and the amount of domain knowledge, Samunati as a company sends out its management trainees every year to get embedded in an FPO. And we are very fortunate that we get some highly talented youngsters from IRMA, from some of the top management schools. And most of them have the humility and the grace to come back and say, nothing that we studied prepared us for what we saw on the ground. Secondly, the enormous amount of innovative expertise, I would call it expertise. If you and I were sent out to a farm, we basically ruin it in about 15 days' time. So simply the entire embedded technology of production, supply chain management, for shall we say, preparing books of accounts, today it's on a website, right? For compliance, there are enough CAs who will do it for 5,000, as low as 5,000 rupees. So I do not see the managerial challenge as the real challenge. I, in all humility, say that capital is the key challenge. Fair access to markets is the second challenge. Technology is on the shelf. Even the remotest tribal farmer today is aware of all the hybrid varieties of maize. The reason that they don't invest in those varieties is because they don't see a market. They don't see a return. So why should they? Have we come up with a solution where maybe a small ethanol plant could be owned collectively by a group of cooperatives and FPOs, where the output is being bought by the PSUs, which are happily buying from the sugar companies, including sugar cooperatives? So we need solutions like that.
Super. Thank you. You talk about capital and markets, and as you look at the digital landscape evolving, we're seeing many solutions trying to actually bridge the capital and markets problem, using tech. And we're seeing a lot more funding to the ag tech space. We have our first half unicorn, and I'm sure that by the end of the year or early next year we'll have a unicorn. Shiv, as you look at the digital opportunity, how do you see the landscape evolving, and what will digital really mean for small and marginal farmers? Sorry, Meghla, but at the last mile, and how will this play out?
See, within digital, there are two kinds of interventions happening. The first kind, a lot more, which is there are multiple problems to be solved, and there are multiple point solutions using digital is one kind. So today, if you have these 1,200 agtech startups engaged in the agri-food chain, most of them are really looking at solving one problem or two problems within these issues. Whether it is crop monitoring or through remote sensing or image processing and therefore some kind of a diagnostic, or it is traceability or helping precision farming and so on. So there is one kind that a host of point solutions that are getting solved in a slightly different form today than what happened to date. The second kind is like each of these by themselves don't translate into a solution for the farmer or a higher income for the farmer or a lower risk, because they only do just that bit. It is important that farmer receives them as an end-to-end solution. It's really up to the farmer then to pick up of that end-to-end, which part of it makes sense to me and therefore I take as a farmer. And therefore there's a second lot which are getting built as what we call solution integrators. These platforms stitch together multiple of these point solutions so that from a farmer-centric perspective, you have this end-to-end that is available. And these solution integrators also have or will need to have on-ground delivery capacity, whether it is by linking up with the FPOs or through other forms of collectives or village-level entrepreneurs or through the field staff, including a fair amount of physical infrastructure. When we talk about digital, a fair amount of physical infrastructure, be it in terms of demonstration farms or be it in terms of warehouses for disaggregation of imports or aggregation of output. So the solution integrator are essentially phygital in its form. So that's one role, for example, that we play as ITC Mars, the current version of the e-chopper. The third piece that will make all of this much more scalable in due course of time is something that government can play or has just about initiated over the last couple of years, is creating interoperable standards so that all these multiple active companies and solution integrators, all of them really over time are able to operate much like we have seen in the financial sector. And the agri-stack, which standardizes some base data, be it the farmer ID or a crop ID or land record linkages and so on, so that the successful solutions which actually translate into delivering value to consumers or the farmers or other legs of the value chain, then are able to interoperate and make use of this kind of standard architecture that potentially that the government can do. So I think all of this can do things in a manner that we haven't been able to do so far, because either we had the ability to personalize a solution for the farmer, or we could do it on scale without personalizing. Technology enables us to personalize and scaling simultaneously. I think that's what these point solutions plus solution integrator, which is digital, together with a larger interoperable architecture, is what digital can solve. And obviously, all this means to the farmer is the original objective that I mentioned: better linkage to the market and therefore higher prices and lower risk, and so on. And the precision farming leading to better utilization of the natural resources.
Got it. No, thanks, Shiv. And this solution integrator, this and the digital model that you talk about, we're seeing a lot of, let's say, ecosystem-led plays that are coming together with this last mile rural micro entrepreneur, right? And I think the big question is, who is that rural micro entrepreneur, and how do we drive viability of that as a real kind of opportunity and business model? Do you have any kind of thoughts, perspectives, or have you seen that as you've been looking at this space? Yeah,
like I said, it's a combination. Rural entrepreneur is one model. Collectives playing a similar kind of a role potentially will increasingly take on that kind of a role. Even when we saw, for example, the entrepreneur in the e-chopal system over the last 20 years, the Sanchalak, within 3-4 years, we realized that it is not one person. More successful Sanchalaks were nano enterprises in themselves. It was a husband-wife combination or a two-brother combination, father-son combination, or some hired feet on street. So they evolved into nano enterprises and they became more successful. So when you put together the role that needs to be played that links the farmers with access to all of these things, whether it is capital, other inputs, or the output markets and the advisory service and all of that. It can be entrepreneur, it can be an FPO. And when you're talking about entrepreneurs here, if you believe that from day one they will be viable and therefore there will be millions of entrepreneurs who will be coming up, it is unlikely it will happen that way. You need a network, and the network orchestrator needs to really support a revenue model rather than each one inventing their own models. So it is the freelance entrepreneurs attached to a larger network. That's a kind of a model which worked in many other systems. If, for example, in the days before We have seen all these mobile telephones and all of that. If the STD booth operators were there, they were all individual entrepreneurs, but they are connected to a larger network and a business model. Individual entrepreneur is not inventing a business model. It is connected to a larger network and which is creating that kind of a demand system. So I think entrepreneurs need to be attached to that kind of system where they play a role. But increasingly, it will be FPOs playing that kind of an entrepreneurial role, which get linked to these kind of networks also.
Thank you. Meghla, over to you, and I think moving from digital and ecosystems, to I think the pressing topic at hand, which is climate. And I think in the same vein, we hear the impact. Pravesh talked about it as well, of crashing factor productivity and the impact of kind of climate change on soil health, on water, and consequently the potential for agriculture today and tomorrow. And we also hear about agriculture as a solution to the climate problem, in terms of carbon capture and storage. There's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture, zero budget farming, many terms around. What are your perspectives on both parts of the climate agriculture equation, and how do we actually create a meaningful, I think, narrative and shift around this in a way that works for farmers in the short and midterm?
Thanks, Aparna. I'm going to do something slightly disobedient because I really want to pick up a couple of the things that came up earlier, and then maybe I circle back to this quickly to conclude. But, so I think this was really a rich and realistic and interesting and very grounded set of perspectives, so also very hopeful. But I do want to step back a little bit and think about the actually existing market and the actually existing state. Right. And we've talked a lot here about, solutions integrators, possibly, large scale corporates, new emerging startups. I think they're all very exciting and very important. And of course, corporate India has been in agriculture for a very long time. So it's not a new actor per se. I mean, many of these major shifts have also happened with, ITC itself has got a very old history in Indian agriculture. But I do want to say that I think somewhere our imagination of the actually existing private tends to view all, the private sector as the organized private sector. And of course, the biggest investors in agriculture are farmers, right? In terms of actually investment to agriculture, farmers put in the largest amount, right? They are private actors. And then we have this big question of the intermediaries, who again we treat as some sort of distortion without understanding that in many cases, a whole range of small, medium firms, intermediaries, transporters, logistics operators, all exist, highly well adapted to the actually existing conditions of production and consumption. This is not to say that they're not exploitative. This is not to say that farmers get a fair shake, but we all know that in many parts, most commodities, we are looking at high volume, low margin businesses with a high degree of distribution of risk, right, across the chains and across these networks. And I do want to just put a plea that when we have this imagination, and I think this is part of what she was also saying about who will emerge as entrepreneurs, that we have a role and imagination for regional capital, for an old set of firms. I mean, we were talking about who are the new people who will go into agriculture, but many of the original firms in mandis and other places remember people like Shiv from when they were very purposeful young people working in cooperatives and used to say, "Ye field wale hai," and they used to talk about field wale officers as well, extension systems which worked. A purposeful public system and a purposeful, different group of, emerging enterprises and corporates and cooperatives in rural India. So I do think, when we talk in these terms, we don't have easy words for aggregators or integrators, but in many cases, small firms play this role, and they play it with a lot of dynamism, a lot of risk. They are the ones who also put up the capital. There is a capital problem. There's an agro-commercial problem. But I do think it's really important for us to think about this. And this is where I think understanding what the role of the state should be in terms of well-directed public investment, well-directed public regulation, and well-directed institutional support without taking over the space of agriculture, which is actually a vibrant private sector, right? It's a private, and the markets have play. And I think this is where I would say that, it's about changing the terms of engagement that both poor producers and poor consumers have with markets. And this is why I wanted to come back, and part of the climate problem is also a consumption problem, but we have to come back to the consumption question. When I began my work in 2007-8, there was a lot of talk about how India was going to diversify consumption. Rising Indian incomes would mean Indians would eat much more in terms of high value food, a lot more protein, a lot more milk. And what we have seen is that diversification story has not quite proceeded apace. We also have a huge problem when it comes to data on consumption. That's an additional problem. But the Indian domestic demand story is still one of a very large number of poor consumers who are not able to get a fair shake at good nutrition. So the state has an important role to play here, but not an overwhelming one. Again, we have to think about what are going to be the solutions. How does one actually change that story as well, right? And I would be interested in very much hearing what Shiv and Pravesh have to say about this, but I really do think the consumption story is going to have to be layered, because sometimes, it's actually production that then drives consumption. Right? Farmers do well, farmers consume more health, more education, they transform by investing in local areas. At other times, it's exports that help farmers do well. So you're not looking at actually rural and domestic markets. We have a domestic market story, which we really have to understand, and the role of still the ICDS, the PDS, the midday meal schemes are remaining incredibly important. So I think, how does one think about decentralization? What is the role of the state to remain in this, and how does it actually pivot and allow transition to happen? Because you have to remember, the Green Revolution, which was the biggest shift in our production systems, was demand driven, but distressed demand. It was, food security, right? And then it led to surplus production of a certain kind, but it did not lead to that kind of diversified nutrition reaching a very large number of people. And we know we have the cereal centricity problem, and other missions haven't quite done what we did with wheat and paddy. So I think there's a real challenge here. And I think we need to have very honest but creative solutions in this space. And I do want to say that, this is where thinking about who the private sector is and who is likely to stay and invest in these areas, who is going to stay and send their kids to local institutions and all the others. And I think this is also where the role of public investment for rural income is so important. Farmers are spending a huge amount of whatever little earnings they have and going into debt because of health and education. Right? So unless we understand that these are areas where we have to reduce the amount that they're bleeding on those very important things about human capability, we are not going to solve some of these other problems. So I think that I did want to put that here for all of us to consider in closing this loop. Yeah. And I think for climate as well, consumption is a big part of the story. Right? When you think about how you're going to reshape to think about demand, right? We have been talking about the role of paddy, for example, in a certain kind of story when it comes to water, when it comes to soil, where are the appropriate places to be growing different kinds of crops. And I think, here is where thinking differently about nutrition and going back to the food, fuel, feed problem that was put right on the table by Pravesh right at the beginning is going to be critical. And I think this is again a state capacity challenge. We will need a very different framework and approach to deal with emerging science, how to take trade-offs and decisions where short-term gain and short-term costs, political costs as well as economic gains, seem very visible, whereas long-term implications are less, and we're going to have to balance. We've never built a system for temporal movement that is actually transitional, right? We solve an immediate crisis. What we actually need are frameworks and systems that move transitionally now, that actually think about what kinds of capacities, institutions do we need. And this is where I think you can't do it without your agricultural universities being robust, your district level systems being really dynamic and creative, where you need much more support about private and public science in agriculture. And the social and the technical are going to have to come together, and the organizational. So I think we have like a really critical, I think, capacity challenge here, because we're going to have to think differently than we have usually done in our responses to agriculture, which have been very short term, and critically you needed a crisis, but climate is not like the other crises that we faced. So I think it is going to be vital, but we are going to need a political consensus around it, and you're going to need to build institutions with different horizons. But yeah, I would be really curious on the whole consumption, and sorry to hear from others, because my sense is we're not having the kinds of income rises that we need to see to drive consumption in the way that we thought it would happen.
No, absolutely. I think, Meghla, you've raised many important points around the role of stable markets. What is the market? I think, consumption. And maybe before we open up to the audience, I'll ask Pravesh to come in, and then, Shiv, if you have any comments as well. And then I think we should definitely take audience questions. There are some very good ones.
Thank you, Aparna. I just thought I'll very briefly, intervene to request Meghla if she'd like to reconsider this last bit, and she opened with that. I don't think that factually you could really say that the diversification story is a failed story, because look, let's be, at least we can differ on opinions, but we can't differ on facts. The truth is that the last decade has seen a positive growth in agriculture year on year. COVID was the only, COVID actually showed this up in stark contrast, that every quarter, while, there was a huge dip in the other two sectors, agriculture continued to grow. If you look at the share of high value agriculture versus cereals, so high value agriculture means horticulture, poultry, milk, dairy, meat. About 15 years ago, 75% or around 70% of the agri GDP value came from cereals, and only around 30% came from the high value segment. Today, that has reversed completely. Today, 70% of the agri GDP value comes from the high value segment, and only 30% from cereals and the traditional crops, pulses, etc. So I think while I am not questioning your assertion that there are pools of malnutrition, which is, shall we say, accessibility and affordability and distribution issue. In terms of actual consumption, look, you do know that for the last 4 years consecutively, horticulture production is more than food grains production.
Correct.
By a healthy, and food grains is something that you can actually store, but horticulture is a perishable product. That means there is demand to sustain that. Today, the single biggest component of the monthly consumption basket and inflation today is being led by the price of tomato, right? Which was not such an important crop. Let's see, when we were growing up in the 70s, tomato was like a little thing you added, and certainly the poorer households did not consume tomato of the volumes that we are. So I'm just trying to say that let's not maybe make a very definitive statement here. Yes, I completely agree that some of the segments that we would have liked to see change food habits have not changed it to that extent. But I don't think for any of the high value crops you can state a year where there has been a dip in production.
No, I completely, in fact, I completely agree. And in fact, I would say that is a great example of how markets work. Right, it has actually been market-led and demand-driven that we've seen this diversification, and that our markets have been responsive to it. Right, largely private, small-scale, intermediated markets have been very dynamic and have reacted. And farmers have themselves, changed production patterns and all. I absolutely agree. I mean, the work in Bihar, in Odisha, many places you are seeing this. I don't disagree at all. I think the larger point was, are we seeing, the assumption was that diversification of diets would be driven by rising incomes, and it would sustain over a long period of time. Right? We saw a decade of and maybe even a little more of very strong sustained. Now, COVID is a special moment, but even before that, we started seeing a sort of stabilization in some of this. We're not seeing the index of diversification. Again, therefore, the role, again, not to say that it's not important or that it's not happening at all, but how well distributed is it? Therefore, the question of what will be the mix of public and private that will drive better nutritional change. Will it only be income driven, or will we also have to have a mix of solutions? I think some of those questions, but overall, the point you've made is exactly the point, that we are very dynamically responsive to demand, but we have a consumption side challenge too. And how do we support Indian consumers and citizens in that transition, given that incomes are not moving as rapidly as we would expect them to move, is a question that I have. But I completely agree with you on that.
Is anything you want to add, to this before we kind of move themes?
Yeah, just a cryptic point that both consumption diversification and production diversification has happened, and that movement could have been certainly faster, and movement could have helped farmers realize more incomes and preserve more natural resources. But the only reason that did not deliver these kind of benefits is because we are still trying to manage these shifts with yesterday's institutions and instruments that were essentially designed for production-driven supply chains. The entire marketing system, the production system, the extension system, the logistics, all of these were designed and served very well and will continue to serve well for certain segments of our agriculture. But if you want to use the same institution instruments for all of these things, for example, the point on the role of the small intermediaries, yeah, they do a very efficient job at extremely low cost in the chain. But because each one of them act as a principal with the next leg, at a whole chain, we become very inefficient. That works all right for grains which are not perishable, but it doesn't work for perishables. And therefore, when I say demand responsive, the nature of institutional instruments need to be very, very different. They'll certainly make use of all these small entrepreneurs and all of that. But I think it is just trying to drive forward with just the rear view mirror is not good enough. And that's where all the troubles are.
Thank you, Shiv. Maybe we can move to some of the audience Q&A, and Shiv, I'll direct this one to you. Abhishek Singh wants to know, farmers are given significant efforts to make agriculture prosperous, but shouldn't we move ahead in the value chain and processing to make agriculture enterprising and aspirational for young people? And maybe I'll add to that, which is, Shiv, we're hearing a lot about things like aquaculture, livestock and poultry, in terms of diversification and allied have been, on the cards for a while. So maybe you can also comment on that in terms of, the role of processing as well as the allied sectors.
Yeah, firstly, making agriculture an interesting source of livelihood or occupation for the next generation is not a single dimensional issue. In the first instance, it needs to be obviously remunerative. That's a starting point. The dignity of labor needs to shift. That means this whole thing needs to be seen as more knowledge intensive activity. Like Ravesh said, if any of us go to do agriculture, we'll ruin the farm in no time. But still, we don't give enough dignity to that kind of labor which is going into it, that how knowledge intensive this job is. And when that is brought in through whatever that needs to happen, whether it is some agriculture practical curriculum in the schools all the way as awareness and things of that kind, and other tools that we talked about in digital and all of that. And the third is to reduce the drudgery that is involved. A lot of activity today, whether it is productivity raising or drudgery reduction, can happen with a fair amount of tools that are possible. And a combination of many of these need to happen to make it attractive. And part of that, one more element is going to be how do you add value? If the the demand response is for processed, so be it. But if demand is for fresh, so that would be for different kind of products. And if you produce per demand, there are multiple models of doing it. You don't need to store and process necessarily. Certainly, we need to do more processing than what we are doing today. But it is just but one element, but all these other things also need to be seen as a multidimensional issue before we make it attractive for anybody to get into agriculture.
Thank you, Shiv. Pravesh, the next one's for you. Shailesh Nagar asks, one of the key issues in agriculture has been soil degradation. Across the world, the push is towards transforming food systems through approaches like regenerative and agroecology. How do we ensure that the capital requirements in the sector are aligned with shifts in food systems that promote regeneration, agroecology, agroforestry, etc.?
So I think Shiv, in his last intervention, has already given the answer. It has to be at the very bottom, remunerative and attractive to keep people doing that activity. Why do people leave very high-paying jobs and even in the service sector or manufacturing sector and go into other jobs? Because they find that even though maybe the salary and other perks may be very attractive, there is a certain amount of boredom, or there's a certain amount of non-rewarding aspect of that job, right? You hear of people doing this all the time. And the same holds true for a farmer. And his additional challenge is that most of the time, it's not even rewarding for him, right? FAO calls a farm a factory without a roof, right? You have a 120-day crop and it's looking fabulous up to the 119th day. And on the 120th day, there's a hailstorm and that's it, right? So I can't obviously spend time going to details, but I think that we'll need to put together, many people have said this, the ecosystem that addresses risks, that addresses capital requirements, that allows people to access markets fairly and have a fair share of the consumer value. Globally, in agriculture, especially in the Western world, the farmer's share of the consumer's dollar or whatever currency you have is around 50%. In India, on an average, actually for some crops it's much lower, it's around 25%. Now the challenge that countries like India have is to take this 25% share of the consumer rupee to maybe close to 50%. I agree we can't get to 50% in even 5 years or 10 years, but can we take it to at least 30, 35 to begin with, maybe get to around 40 in 5-7 years time? That's what's going to make people feel that they are being rewarded in agriculture, and therefore they invest in technologies, whether regenerative or all the other necessary things that they need to do to keep the farm productive, to keep the soil healthy, to utilize water in a sensible way. This ultimately has to be based on the viability of the enterprise that he's running. Thank you.
Thanks, Pravesh. Meghla, I think following from this theme, you talked about how there is distress, diversification away from agriculture, as well as success-linked diversification, right? What are some of the new job roles that you're seeing emerging in rural India, on the back of agriculture, or perhaps, moving on from agriculture? What does that really look like? What are the jobs of the future, and, what will it take to make them successful?
Yeah. So I think some of the really important questions here, and I think this was the point which I was saying about the rear view mirror, or what one has often seen, right, is that farmers respond very, sharply to a larger social, political, and economic space, right? So it was very interesting. In a place like Harda, which went from cotton to soybean and had canal irrigation, you saw farmers in the first phase of actually doing well, right, first invest in the farm itself, right? As they start doing well, they put in money for production. So actually, this is a sector where public investment or capital flow gets quickly pushed with private investments of different kinds, where the first thing they do, you saw actually a lot of land swapping hands, people consolidating, growing, changing as the dynamics change, right? So if you have a dynamic context, people actually first invest in production, and they do a whole range of things around production and change. The second major shift you start seeing is that they start investing in education. And I think this is an important point because we've been talking about how to get youth back in agriculture. One of the things you'll realize with agricultural agrarian homes is everybody doesn't stay in agriculture. Right? It's in a household. So it's very common for certain people in the household to move out of agriculture and others to stay in, right? So there's a big move. You start seeing people actually start investing in education. Then you start seeing this whole push to look for side businesses. Right? Some of them will be linked to agriculture itself. You'll start seeing dealerships come up. People will start getting into transport, logistics. So people who have a little extra will actually come into that, both into consumption and the production side, right? The deeper parts in the market, logistics, transport, people will start adding. In some parts of India, they enter the market itself, right? So in Punjab, you actually started seeing after the Green Revolution, farmers become artiyas, right? And enter into some of those things. You don't see it in states where that space does not exist for farmers, right? Either through networks or other things. And they actually move out and don't end up entering agricultural markets, but will often do other things. So for certain communities in Harda where they did not enter there, they actually got into consumption. So shopkeeping, retailing, actually picking up. And the joke became, this is why the consumption challenge is interesting. The joke became, Harda teri kya pehchan, har ghar ke piche do dukaan. Right, that people are now, setting up a lot of shops where there's a lot of mortality also. That people are just opening and closing shutters. Shops are not actually that active, but they often pick up good. They actually move into services. And we have to remember, in India, a big part of diversification, distress-driven diversification has actually been construction. People have moved into construction and to labor. That is a major part of where people have shifted. But the services have always been, again, an important part. So people often will end up, and then back into rural services, you can actually see health, education grow. If we built space in those, right? We actually had both public and private investments going into health and education. Farming families go into this. Right? So the way again, people often define and describe themselves as that we used to be a village of townsmen. We are now a town of villagers. Right? That there is this constant mobility. So I think what you see in this are both the limits and possibilities. Right. And I think this is where much greater investment, we always talk about processing, and all of these kinds of dynamics can be built out more local industry, local services with an imagination. And I think this is where the state, and I'm not saying government, but a sense of public value needs to really come into our understanding of rural and urban transformations in India, where agriculture is a multiplier. It is not seen as a welfare sector, a drag of the economy, but a multiplier for change. And then we grow an imagination that is forward thinking and, has all these elements, the digital and the phygital. There's lots of jobs here, I think, in this, both as people grow out. So that's at least what I've seen. You see both the opportunities and the limits, and it's the limits that we have to now really take on.
Absolutely. No, I think thanks, Meghla, for that. I'm mindful that we have 5 minutes left. I've gotten a warning. So I'm going to, turn it over to each of our panelists and ask if you have any, final thoughts, maybe take a minute and a half. What are the two big takeaways from this session that, you leave with, or unanswered questions, perhaps? Shiv, maybe you first.
Yeah, I think just building on what Meghla just said, is that, the jobs of the future in agriculture and food and feed and fuel, whatever value chain that we have, would be quite different from the jobs of the past. And jobs could be entrepreneurial roles, or working for farmers, working for somebody else, and all of that. I think that recognition is key. I think the services roles attached to agricultural change are not recognized as well as they should be, whether it's input provision or farming itself or output market linked. We talked about an ecosystem to make FPO successful. So which would mean a huge amount of ecosystem to first FPO promoting institutions in terms of their own bandwidth, their training, their commercial understanding, and all of that. The office bearers of FPOs, their governance capacity and their management capacity and all of that gets built. The staff of these. So that's one kind that if FPO need to be built in whatever form of these collectives, then that whole ecosystem has enormous amount of services component that are there, and a lot of shared services. Like Pravesh said, accounting, many of these kind of things need not be done inside FPO, but by shared service providers who can provide it for multiple such FPOs and so on. The other is linked to the digital that we talked about, whether it is shared farm equipment management, whether it is the operating and doing all these drones and other kind of stuff, and remote sensing. For remote sensing, there's a huge amount of ground truth verification that is required. There are the roles there in terms of data collection and deployment. So how do you identify these different kinds of services roles, which provide many of these things that we talked about earlier? It enhances the value of farming. It also creates many of these multiplying roles. I think when we see this in an integrated form, then we see what is the opportunity here, rather than restricting it to the conventional definition of what a farmer income or what a farm income is, and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Shiv. Pravesh, you next.
There are three things which are on the ground today which have never taken place in our history. One, you have the highest possible cohort of educated rural women that this country's ever had. Two, you have the highest level of feminization in agriculture. Somebody referred to it, I think, earlier anyway. And the third, which from my point of view is actually the most significant, and institutions like TRIF have a lot of role that they have played in this, is that we have more than 8 million women's self-help groups in this country. There has actually been an institutional revolution which has taken place at the grassroots, especially targeting women, but we have not recognized it. And we have certainly not leveraged it. And I see this triad as actually holding the promise to completely transform the agriculture sector in the next decade. So how do we take these 80 lakh plus women's SHGs into formal bodies like FPOs? I'm happy to even see cooperatives in some areas. How do we use this platform to channel the cutting edge technologies required to address all the other things that we talked about? And that's the way that I see value emerging in agriculture. Men are going to continue to migrate out of the villages as the economy revives, as construction picks up. Even in the informal services sector, it will mostly be men, and that's what the data is telling us too. But what's going to happen to this basic literacy, equipped woman who's going to be left behind on the farm? I think that many of the challenges that we spoke about in this session can be addressed by the institutional revolution that can build on this beautiful triad that has been created. I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Pravesh. Mekhla?
I think that's a pretty good place to close, actually. But I think the lesson, one thing I think we've all emphasized, and it is about creating enabling environments and new institutions. We need a different framework for how we think about these interactions. I think I was saying it before, but I'll say it again. We for too long have thought about agriculture as a welfare sector. But also when we think about women, we tend to think about them very, very instrumentally. In a typical sense, like even the nutrition story. When we think about a forward-thinking vision, we are then thinking about women in agriculture, but also women in politics and in the rural economy, and in a different way, right? And I think that's going to require very different kinds of both public and private sector engagement and involvement. And so I think that's the way forward, is to rethink these linkages that we've always thought, and also realize that India's teleology is not going to be anybody else's teleology. We don't have the numbers, the structural transformation numbers, the magic figures of how many people are going to remain in agriculture, but it's not going to be like any other place. And so we're going to have to shape this and not fall prey to teleological thinking. There's going to be a great amount of regional diversity. And in a federal setup, this is going to be, a really complex and hopefully a very inspiring transition for everybody. But that's got to be the way we have to think about it.
I mean, thank you to the three of you, I think, for what has been a delightful discussion, to be able to ask the questions for. And I think, the good news is that while we haven't answered all of them, I know each of you is a prolific writer. So I'm hoping that we will, be able to continue this conversation, in different forums. I do want to thank, TRIF and the India Rural Colloquy platform for giving us, the space to be able to have this conversation. And also, of course, the audience who's, stuck with us for the last 90 minutes. So I think thank you, everyone. And, especially thank you to our three panelists for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Aparna. Thanks, Pravesh and Rachel.